In just 53 seconds, an $84.7 million secret deal disappeared from Albany's database. Zohran Mamdani didn't even untie his shoes. He lifted the red folder in his hand and began to read. Cameras leaned forward. The chamber froze. What did Zohran Mamdani expose that made New York's most powerful real estate lobby stop smiling and start whispering? At exactly 2:14 p.m. on March 15, 2025, in the marble corridors of New York City Hall, a routine housing committee hearing was about to become a political earthquake. The afternoon sun streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across polished floors where footsteps echoed like distant thunder. In Conference Room 401, 27 council members sat behind curved mahogany desks, their nameplates gleaming under fluorescent lights. Zohran Mamdani walked in like a tenant organizer who had memorized every broken promise. His navy blazer was slightly wrinkled, his tie loosened from a morning of community meetings in Astoria. Under his arm, a thick binder with color-coded tabs labeled District 36, FOIL requests, and in red marker, Urgent, March 15. His phone buzzed constantly in his pocket, texts from tenant activists, missed calls from journalists, and one particularly insistent number from a blocked caller. At the head of the chamber, Council Speaker Adrienne Adams shuffled through her prepared remarks about collaborative housing solutions and public-private partnerships. Her voice carried the practiced cadence of someone who had given the same speech dozens of times. Behind her, three men in identical dark suits whispered among themselves, occasionally glancing at expensive watches that probably cost more than most New Yorkers paid in monthly rent. The man in the center, Robert Castellano, was everything wrong with New York real estate, wrapped in a $5,000 suit. As senior partner at Meridian Development Group, he controlled more square footage in Queens than some small countries. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his American flag pin catching the light as he leaned back in his chair with the confidence of someone who had never worried about a security deposit. Today's discussion, Speaker Adams announced, focuses on the Affordable Housing Preservation Act and our continued commitment to working families across the 5 boroughs. Her words echoed off the walls, but they felt hollow, rehearsed. We welcome input from all stakeholders in this vital conversation. Zohran's fingers drummed against his binder. Inside were 47 pages of documents that would shatter every assumption about how housing policy was really made in New York City. 3 months of FOIL requests, leaked emails and financial records that painted a picture of corruption so systematic it was almost artistic in its scope. At 2:18 p.m., Speaker Adams called for public comments. The first speaker was Maria Santos, a 67-year-old grandmother from the Bronx, whose rent had tripled in 2 years. She spoke in halting English about eviction notices and choosing between medication and housing. Her voice cracked as she described her disabled grandson sleeping on a friend's couch because their one-bedroom apartment couldn't accommodate his wheelchair. Castellano scrolled through his phone during her testimony, occasionally typing messages to someone named Vincent about dinner reservations and weekend plans in the Hamptons. His indifference was so complete, it felt deliberate, a performance of power for the cameras. The second speaker was James Patterson from the Real Estate Board of New York. His voice was smooth as aged whiskey as he explained how market-driven solutions and regulatory flexibility would solve the housing crisis. He used words like streamlining and optimization while carefully avoiding terms like displacement or profit margins. Behind him, Castellano nodded approvingly, finally looking up from his phone. At 2:24 p.m., Zohran was called to speak. He stood slowly, deliberately, like a chess player who had been thinking 10 moves ahead for months. The room's energy shifted. Council members who had been checking email suddenly looked up. Castellano's smile faded by exactly 3 degrees.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, Zohran began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent years fighting for working families. I want to talk about a company called Meridian Development Group and their innovative approach to affordable housing. Castellano's hand tightened around his coffee cup. Behind him, one of his associates opened a laptop and began typing furiously. In the gallery, a woman with a press badge leaned forward, pen poised over her notepad. According to documents filed with the Department of Buildings, Zohran continued. Opening his binder to the first red tab,
Meridian received $847 million in public subsidies over the past 3 years for affordable housing development. He paused, letting the number hang in the air like smoke from a distant fire. That's enough money to build 4,200 truly affordable units at union wages. The math was devastating in its simplicity. $847 million divided by 4,200 units equaled roughly $200,000 per apartment, enough to build quality housing that working families could actually afford. But the reality was far different. Instead, Zohran said, his voice sharpening like a blade being honed, Meridian built 1,100 units with an average rent of $3,400 per month. That's not affordable housing. That's gentrification with a government subsidy. Speaker Adams shifted uncomfortably in her chair. The prepared script for this hearing was supposed to focus on incremental improvements and bipartisan cooperation. This was not going according to plan. Castellano stood up, his chair scraping against the marble floor. Point of order, Madam Speaker. Councilmember Mamdani is making unsubstantiated accusations without proper verification procedures. But Zohran was ready. He had been ready for 3 months. Mr. Castellano, I'm glad you're here to clarify the record. His tone was polite, almost friendly, but there was steel underneath. Perhaps you can explain these emails between your company and Deputy Mayor Richardson's office. He lifted a stack of printed emails, each page meticulously highlighted and annotated. The first email was dated September 12, 2024, with the subject line, Meridian Phase 2 Zoning Adjustments Required. This email from your development director, Sarah Chen, specifically requests flexibility on affordability requirements for units above the 30th floor. Zohran's voice carried across the chamber like a prosecutor delivering closing argument. The response from Deputy Mayor Richardson's chief of staff states, we can work with 60% AMI instead of 50%. Consider it done. The room erupted in a low murmur. AMI stood for Area Median Income. The difference between 50% and 60% meant thousands of additional dollars in monthly rent, pricing out exactly the families these programs were supposed to help. Castellano's face flushed red. Those communications are taken out of context. Development is a complex process requiring ongoing dialogue between stakeholders. Context. Zohran flipped to another tab. This one marked financial records. Let's talk about context. According to Meridian's own financial filings, your profit margin on subsidized housing projects averages, for comparison, most affordable housing developers work with margins between. The numbers landed like physical blows. In the gallery, reporters were frantically taking notes. One woman held up her phone, live streaming the exchange to what appeared to be several thousand viewers. Speaker Adams tapped her gavel. Councilmember Mamdani, we need to maintain decorum in these proceedings. But decorum was the last thing on Zohran's mind. 3 months ago, he had received a call from Elena Rodriguez, a single mother of 2 who worked double shifts as a hospital custodian. She had been promised an affordable unit in one of Meridian's new developments. After waiting 18 months on a list, she was finally offered an apartment for $2,900 per month. With her annual income of $32,000, she would need to spend 108% of her gross pay just on rent. Madam Speaker, Zohran continued, the people of New York deserve to know where their tax dollars are going. He opened his binder to a new section, this one containing bank records and wire transfer receipts. These documents show a pattern of cost overruns that consistently favor Meridian subcontractors, all of which happen to be owned by shell companies registered to the same address in Delaware. The Delaware connection was the smoking gun. 3 companies, Empire Construction, Atlantic Materials, and Hudson Electrical, had billed Meridian a combined $127 million for work on subsidized projects. All 3 companies were registered to a single office building in Wilmington, a building that also housed 47 other corporate entities with no employees and no phone numbers. Castellano was no longer sitting. He paced behind his chair like a caged animal, whispering urgently to his associates. One of them, a thin man with nervous eyes, kept glancing at the exit doors. Furthermore, Zohran said, his voice gaining momentum like a train picking up speed, Internal communications show that Meridian routinely classified luxury amenities as accessibility improvements to justify additional public funding. He held up a receipt. A $340,000 wine cellar was billed as a food storage accessibility feature. Gasps echoed through the chamber. In the back row, an elderly man in a veteran's cap shook his head in disgust. This was taxpayer money being used to subsidize wine collections while working families slept in their cars. At 2:31 p.m., something unprecedented happened. Council member Jessica Gonzalez, a usually quiet representative from Staten Island, stood up. "Madam Speaker, I move to hold an emergency vote on suspending all city contracts with Meridian Development Group, pending a full investigation." The motion sent shockwaves through the chamber. Emergency votes were almost never called during committee hearings, and certainly not over the objections of the Speaker's office. But Gonzalez had heard enough. Speaker Adams looked panicked. "Council Member Gonzalez, that motion is out of order. We need proper notice and—" "I second the motion." The voice belonged to David Kim from Brooklyn, another usually reliable vote for the establishment. Then Maria Rivera from the Bronx stood up. "I second as well." One by one, council members began standing. Some were longtime critics of the real estate industry, but others were surprising. Moderate Democrats who typically avoided controversial votes. The momentum was undeniable. Castellano grabbed the microphone. "This is a witch hunt based on selectively edited documents. Meridian has contributed hundreds of millions to New York's economy and created thousands of jobs." But Zohran was already flipping to his final section, the one marked employment records. His smile was thin but genuine. "Mr. Castellano, about those jobs." He lifted a spreadsheet showing employment data for Meridian's affordable housing projects. "According to your own HR department, 73% of construction workers on subsidized projects were paid below prevailing wage rates, despite contracts requiring union-scale compensation. The prevailing wage violation was potentially criminal." Union representatives in the gallery looked furious. Their members had been undercut by the very company that was supposed to be creating good jobs with taxpayer money. "Moreover," Zohran continued, "safety inspection records show repeated violations that resulted in 3 hospitalizations and 14 OSHA citations. When workers tried to organize for better conditions, Meridian fired the entire crew and hired replacements through a temp agency registered to, you guessed it, Delaware." By 2:35 p.m., the hearing had devolved into chaos. Half the council was on their feet, demanding a vote. Reporters were shouting questions at Castellano, who was backing toward the exit with his associates forming a protective circle. Camera flashes strobed like lightning in a storm. But Zohran wasn't finished. He had saved the most devastating revelation for last. "Finally," he said, his voice cutting through the noise like a sword through silk, "I want to read from an internal memo dated February 8, 20. The chamber fell silent. Even the reporters stopped shouting. This memo from Meridian's CEO to the board of directors states, "The affordable housing program represents our highest margin opportunity. By maintaining technical compliance while maximizing profit extraction, we can achieve returns exceeding market rate development while enjoying public subsidy. The key is ensuring regulatory capture at the municipal level." Regulatory capture. The phrase hung in the air like a toxic cloud. It meant that Meridian didn't just work with city government, they had effectively taken control of the regulatory process designed to oversee them. Castellano was at the door now, his face pale as parchment. Behind him, his associates were frantically making phone calls, presumably to lawyers and crisis management firms. In the gallery, tenant activists who had driven in from Queens began chanting, "Housing for people, not for profit." At exactly 2:37 p.m., Speaker Adams called for order one final time. But order was the last thing anyone wanted. Councilmember Gonzalez's emergency motion had gained support from 17 members, more than enough to force a vote. The vote itself was swift and brutal. 26 members voted to suspend Meridian's contracts pending investigation, only 1 member abstained, and 0 voted against. It was the kind of unanimous condemnation typically reserved for convicted felons, not major city contractors. As the gavel came down, Zohran closed his binder with a soft thud.
3 months of investigation, 47 pages of evidence, and 53 seconds that changed everything. In the gallery, Elena Rodriguez wiped tears from her eyes. For the first time in 18 months, she had hoped that the system might actually work for people like her. But the real impact was just beginning. Within hours, Meridian Files was trending on social media. Local news stations led their evening broadcasts, with footage of Castellano fleeing the chamber. The state attorney general's office announced a criminal investigation. Federal prosecutors issued preservation notices for all Meridian-related documents. By 6 p.m., Meridian's stock price had dropped 23%. By midnight, 3 board members had resigned. By the end of the week, the company would be under federal investigation for fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy to defraud the United States government. The ripple effects spread far beyond New York. In Chicago, activists used Zohran's methodology to expose similar schemes. In Los Angeles, housing advocates demanded their own document dumps. In Boston, Philadelphia, and Miami, real estate companies suddenly found themselves under intense scrutiny from local governments that had previously rubber-stamped their every request. But perhaps the most important impact was on Elena Rodriguez and thousands of families like her. The emergency vote to suspend Meridian's contracts freed up $42 million in public housing funds. Those funds were redirected to genuinely affordable housing projects with real oversight and community input. 6 months later, Elena moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in a worker-owned housing cooperative in Astoria. Her rent, $980 per month, including utilities. Her new home was 3 blocks from her children's school and 2 subway stops from her job at the hospital. For the first time in years, she could afford to take her kids to the movies. The moral of the story wasn't complicated. Sometimes the strongest weapon isn't a subpoena or a press conference. It's truth, documented and revealed at the right moment. Sometimes democracy works exactly as designed, when citizens elect leaders who remember they work for the people, not the powerful. But as Zohran packed up his binder that afternoon, he knew this was just the beginning. Meridian was one company in one city. The real estate industry's capture of housing policy was a national crisis that would require sustained, coordinated action across dozens of cities and states. Still, as he walked through the marble corridors of City Hall, past the tourists and school groups, and elderly citizens waiting to speak at the next hearing, Zohran allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Today, David had beaten Goliath. Today, the system had worked. Today, working families had won. In his pocket, his phone buzzed with a new text message from Elena Rodriguez. "Thank you for not giving up on us." And in that moment, Zohran knew exactly why he had gotten into politics in the first place. What happens when elected officials remember they work for the people, not the powerful? If this story of accountability and courage inspired you, like and subscribe to see what happens when democracy actually works for working families. Hit that notification bell because the next victory might be in your city. What would you do if you had evidence this explosive? Drop your answer in the comments below. This story is dramatized for educational purposes, inspired by real housing advocacy and political accountability efforts. All characters and events are fictional, created to explore themes of corruption, transparency, and grassroots democracy.